Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take some questions, and they are all coming from Twitter this week. We're going to start off with Always Vote, who asks, "What are the Hendon reports in the public order, the Emergency Act public inquiry, and the testimony from former Ottawa Police Chief Peter Slowly, and who was Hendon? Thanks." So the Hendon reports is not about a person, but regarding an OPP investigation. It was called Project Hendon, and it was a 2-year rolling investigation into criminal extremism and large-scale protest movements in Ontario during the course of the pandemic. And the first time we've seen any of these reports has been at this public inquiry. So that's what Hendon refers to. What we've also found out is that the OPP is one of the few police forces in Canada who's doing a lot of work looking into far-right extremism in the country. And so they're the ones who are kind of doing that heavy lifting, and we're seeing some of the results of that during this public inquiry. So that's what that refers to. Next question is from Cheryl Robinson. She actually asks two here, which are very similar. First one, why hasn't there been more broad media coverage about the exorbitant accommodation costs, about the hotel for the Queen's funeral? There has been coverage. Frankly, we are in a fire hose of news right now, and there's only so many journalists to cover these things and so much attention span to go around. It is being covered. It's not headline news every day because, frankly, it doesn't deserve to be headline news. That's pretty much the answer to that. Also asks, why aren't journalists more generally aggressively pursuing Minister Rodriguez on his incredulous statement that he was unaware of the Laith Marouf funding? Frankly, it's not that incredulous. Ministers don't know what every single program funding that goes through their office does. They don't sign everything personally. They don't personally micromanage these kinds of things. They have program officers who do that. The ministers are largely more general, large-scale direction and so on. So frankly, it's not incredulous that he wouldn't know. So really there's not much to tell there. I have a couple questions from Leah, who asks, is Danielle Smith catastrophically overestimating the number of Albertan voters who find these position statements of hers appealing? And a kind of related one, why hasn't the NDP been successful in creating inroads in rural Alberta? They've had enough time. So in the first part, yes, she is catastrophically overestimating the number of people for whom these frankly ludicrous statements appeal to. And that was enough people to get her just barely into the leadership and becoming premier because of the bastardized way in which we do leadership selection. If we had a more reasonable system, she wouldn't be. But unfortunately, we have a system that's easy enough to game, and she managed to do that by getting enough people who resonate with her message to buy memberships and get those votes. Does that mean that the rest of the province isn't going to follow along with her? I mean, this kind of goes in with the second part, because there will be huge swaths of the province, particularly the rural parts, which will vote for her regardless because she's still a quote-unquote conservative nominally, in spite of kind of all indications to the contrary. But at that point, it's more of a tribal affiliation than it is anything else. And as for the second part, why the NDP haven't made inroads into rural Alberta, I would generally ask, have you been to rural Alberta? And speaking as someone who grew up there, that's partially your answer. There is It's kind of a two-part question or two-part answer. One is just the kind of mentality of rural Alberta, which is fairly socially conservative and fairly, yeah, small c conservative all around. So it's difficult for anyone else to make any inroads in there. The second part of that is that the only reason the NDP really kind of got in the first place after Jim Prentice's disaster was because everyone was so angry with Jim Prentice, and the NDP was the only real alternative because the Alberta Liberals were leaderless at that point and kind of in a shambles, and the Wild Rose was, they'd just gotten Brian Jean as their leader and they were kind of in a shambles, and so everyone kind of looked at the NDP, who were reasonably pretty much the only party that had their act together, and just kind of voted all for them as a result, including in places, rural places, parts of the province, because they were just so angry at Jim Prentice. I don't know that that's going to be able to happen again. And so what we've kind of seen as a result of that is most of the center left, and even to a certain extent, a certain amount of the center right has coalesced around the NDP in Alberta, because most of the other parties have just basically crumbled. The Alberta Liberals can't even get a leader anymore. Like literally nobody put their name forward for that job. So the whole political structure in the province is almost bifurcated into a two-party system at this point, and that's pretty much the only reason why the NDP are doing as well as they are, particularly in the urban areas. I think the other part of that question is the fact that I don't know that there's enough policies that the NDP have nominally which appeal very well to rural communities, unfortunately, and there was some particular backlash during Notley's government around when they tried to impose some kinds of like health and safety regulations in farming and so on, and that got a giant backlash, even though you didn't think it would, but nevertheless it did. And so I don't know that they've necessarily proven that they have those sensibilities. Certainly less so nationally, and the two parties kind of align in many respects, federally and provincially. So that's part of an answer there, and I wish I had something a little more coherent, but that's kind of a bunch of thoughts as to what that situation is looking like. Leah also had another question about Elon Musk and Twitter and the implications for Canadian politicians using the platform. Frankly, I don't see much is going to change, at least for the time being. There's not a lot of other options right now. I don't know that everyone's going to, I mean, a lot of them already have Facebook. I don't know how much more they're going to migrate to that instead of Twitter, but I think it's still too early to tell what's happening there. And the last question is from LiveId, aka Citizen Keen, who asks, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, who is in the race to out-idiot one another, who is winning? Daniel, I mandate against Mandate Smith, or Scott, why should I apologize for allowing a notorious, unrepentant convicted murderer to attend a tough on crime throne speech? Mo. I guess I would kind of answer that in the Obi-Wan Kenobi riddle from the original Star Wars. Who is more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows him? Scott Moe tends to be a follower of whoever the fool is in Alberta, whether that's Kenny and now Danielle Smith. We've seen that recently with Moe's white paper and his kind of quasi-sovereignty act talk himself. Take that for what it is. I think the bigger thing is I think Danielle Smith believes some of what she's saying, whereas I don't know that Scott Moe necessarily does. But yeah, can be a bit of a coin toss sometimes. And that's everything for this week. Thank you for all of your questions. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.